It's time to jump off stuff and boop them in the snoot. Today we are talking about the Corvus Cabal. Welcome to Wargamers on Toast, all of you lovely people. It's me, it's Toast. How are you this wonderful Wednesday? As the intro suggested, today we are talking about the Corvus Cabal, and people who've been here for long enough might be asking why. I mean, I did do a Corvus Cabal video less than a year ago, but a lot of things have changed since then, and I think it's worth going back and checking out my favourite bird people.
The beacon was activated. Who is in danger?
But before we get into all of that, it's time for a little bit of shilling. Please consider leaving a like, a comment and subscribing to the channel, as that helps me fight against that dastardly YouTube algorithmic demon. And if you want to help in a more tangible way, then please consider signing up to my YouTube members or my Patreon, like all of these wonderful people on screen now. Badoosh. And if you don't want to dedicate yourself to a monthly subscription, then feel free to buy me a coffee. And for all my UK viewers, I have partnered with Element Games and I have an affiliate link in the description down below. Simply click on that link for all of your hobby supplies and I get a little kickback with no cost to you. Element Games also have a pretty hefty discount as standard. But with all that shilling out of the way, let's get on with the show.
And now for something completely different.
So like I was saying, Corvus Cabal have had a lot of really interesting changes. A while back in the FAQ, they got a substantial points decrease to their Shri Talon, who's their big bird guy. And last month, with the introduction of battle traits, they actually got one of the best ones in the set. So let's start with their battle trait. It's called Plunging Killaz, and it reads, add 2 to the strength characteristics of melee attack actions made by friendly fighters with this battle trait if they fail this activation. Right off the bat, this battle trait does not work as written, which sounds weird to say out loud, but this battle trait has been written in the style of the Gore Chosen of Drom, which were FAQ'd to actually work. As written, this battle trait doesn't work at all because falling is a very specific action, a very specific keyword that really doesn't work with any kind of combat mechanic. After a lot of talk with TOs and other prominent members of the Warcry community, it has been pretty much agreed that rules as intended, this will absolutely get FAQ'd. It'll be FAQ'd to work like every other Corvus Cabal ability. So let's future-proof this video just a little bit and say instead you just have to end your activation 2 inches further down than when you started. You will see this crop up in a number of places within the ability section of this video, and this is how this will work going forward once a new FAQ drops. I will bet all of my YouTube goodwill on that. So going off the rules as intended interpretation, Plunging Killaz is truly phenomenal. At worst, your chaff are going to strength 5 with a little bit of setup, and everything else is going to strength 6. This actually allows the Corvus Cabal to do a fair chunk of damage with even their most basic things, because now they're swinging at strength 5 and punching through other chaff with a fair amount of reliability. Everything else that's not chaff, like the Shadow Piercer or the Spire Stalkers, are now serious threats. These guys have a high attacks characteristic, solid damage, and are now strength 6. Of course, this does require some setup to pull off, meaning you'll have to likely spend a whole turn climbing up something so next turn you can jump off to gain the benefit. Anything that grants a bonus move action makes this so much easier. Think of things like Rampage or their own bespoke quad, which we'll cover later on. And finally, this makes the Shri Talon uniquely powerful as he has a built-in movement mechanic that is fantastic. He will nearly always be strength 6 and he will murderize all kinds of things, but we'll go into that a little bit later. So the battle trait is fantastic. It is especially good on turn 1 and turn 2 deployments, because if you can deploy elevated on turn 1 or turn 2 with like your reinforcements, you are guaranteed to jump off and gain that bonus. And again, people are not prepared for the upcoming terror that is the new Shri Talon. But moving on to abilities, we're going to start with their reaction, and it is called Raptor Strike. A fighter can make this reaction after an enemy fighter finishes a move action visible to this fighter. The caveat being they must be within 5 inches horizontally and vertically lower than this fighter. This fighter makes a bonus move action and must finish closer to that enemy fighter than they were at the start of that move action. If this fighter ends that move action within 1 inch of that enemy fighter, this fighter does not suffer impact damage and that enemy fighter suffers impact damage instead. Raptor Strike is deceptively fantastic and something you really shouldn't forget about, because once you set this up, huge portions of the board become danger zones for your opponent in ways they will not expect. In its most basic use, an enemy is moving towards your objective or a treasure token. They move once, they get into range of your Raptor Strike, you send a chaff in and then you tie them up. Now they have to move around you to get to that objective or that treasure token, or better yet, they have to kill you to get you out of the way, and that also burns their final action. But then you have the tricky stuff. Again, keeping this fairly short, taking that treasure example as an example, if an enemy can't make it to a treasure token that is covered by a Raptor Strike in one move, you can Raptor Strike and pick up that treasure token on their turn. This can be devastating, especially when you can do this with any of your models. Suddenly you have your 20 wound Shadow Piercer jumping off a cliff and taking a treasure. That's pretty darn fantastic. Not only that, you can use this to tie up models that are not the offending party, or even just to move onto objectives or into better positions, because unlike many movement abilities and reactions, you do not need to end within 1 inch to use this reaction. You simply have to end closer than when you started. So you have a pretty darn free movement to do what you want on their turn without repercussion, and provided you are 0.1 inches closer when you end that movement, you're good to go. Of course, you won't get the damage aspect of the reaction, but frankly the damage aspect of Raptor Strike is pretty underwhelming. And finally, Raptor Strike is the easiest of all the Corvus Cabal's jumping abilities because it does not have a minimum height requirement. You just have to be above your opponent when you do this, and that's it. Overall, Raptor Strike is incredibly situational but very, very powerful if you can pull it off at the right time. It does require a setup though, so bear that in mind. That was a moth. A moth flew by my screen. Onto our abilities, we have Raven Dart, which is a double that everybody can use. You pick a visible enemy fighter within 8 inches of this fighter and then roll a dice. On a 2 to a 4, you allocate 1 damage point to the fighter. On a roll of a 5+, allocate a number of damage points to that fighter equal to the value of this ability. Raven Dart is amazing in a way that people often overlook. This looks like your usual first edition kind of bad projectile based ability. It is not that. This is actually better than Onslaught nearly every single time, providing you have a high enough double. Why is that? Corvus Cabal tend to hit on a 5+ to begin with. And of course their chaff only does 1 damage when they attack. Well, Raven Dart does that damage at a range on a 2+ and not a 5+, as a substantial increase in the likelihood to do a little bit of chip. But things get really spicy when you roll that 5+, and it is a 5+ and not a 6+, like many other abilities of this kind. Because most of your chaff only have a crit damage of a 3, and of course critting requires a 6+ to roll, if you have a high enough double, you could be doing twice as much damage as a regular crit would do, but you will do it on a 5+ and not a 6+. I can write a book on the number of times Raven Dart has saved my bacon when playing a game. Even that 1 damage allows you just to chip away a last pip of HP. It allows you to avoid counter. It allows you to reach out and poke things from a distance without having to get in a melee. And of course, if you're banking on that 5+, which is a 1 in 3 chance, you can do some serious damage to even the toughest things in the game, because 6 damage is no joke and you're ignoring all their toughness because you're hitting on a 5+ no matter what, or a 2+ for that little 1 damage poke. I am always considering Raven Dart and what I can do with it when I roll my ability dice, and that's really saying something considering the power of some of the abilities later on this list. This little dart holds its own against some truly outstanding abilities. Moving on to Swift Climb, this can only be used by our Spire Stalkers. Swift Climb reads, until the end of this fighter's activation, do not count the vertical distance moved when this fighter is climbing. Swift Climb is fantastic. It's just a shame that it is locked to the Spire Stalkers, who aren't bad, but they are some of the more expensive units we have access to. Swift Climb more or less makes the board 2D. Everything gets flattened and you can just move in a straight line and do whatever the hell you want. Nothing is going to stop you apart from other models, and honestly, it's pretty darn fantastic for getting to objectives, sneaking away with treasures, and generally being a pain in the bum. You'll be surprised at the number of occasions your opponent will forget about Swift Climb and position in a place where they think they're safe, only to be ambushed by a Spire Stalker coming out of the woodworks and jumping from an impossible height. If you are using Spire Stalkers, then Swift Climb will become a mainstay in your ability repertoire because it is so powerful in a mobility sense. Next up is Harrying Raven, which is locked to our Shadow Piercer and our Cabalist with Familiar. It reads, pick an enemy fighter within 20 inches until the end of the battle round. That fighter cannot make disengage actions. Harrying Raven is really interesting, but it's also very hard to pull off, and like with many Corvus Cabal things, it requires an awful lot of setup to really get advantage out of it. First things first, the benefits. 20-inch range is fantastic and it requires no line of sight. This has a massive bubble and basically nothing can hide from it if you want to use it. The effect is also pretty darn powerful as it allows you to basically net something you don't want to be able to move this turn. And finally, it doesn't require a dice roll to pull off, unlike most nets. You use this and the effect is active and it's pretty darn good. The downside is this pseudo net requires a sacrificial lamb to pull off. The big issue with Harrying Raven is getting something into combat when it actually matters. If you use Harrying Raven first, you're really just telling your opponent to use this model now before you tie them up. If you move a person into combat first, with the assumption to use Harrying Raven on your next activation, well then your guy could just die before they got to move, and while sure that does slow them down, you didn't need Harrying Raven to do that to begin with. So how do you actually pull off a Harrying Raven play? There are three main ways to do it, and by far the easiest is to use Harrying Raven at the start of a turn once you are already in combat. You are already engaged, you're already fighting, and you don't want something to run away, say to get to objectives or whatever else you're trying to avoid things happening. Boom, you take initiative, use Harrying Raven, they're already locked in combat, they can't disengage, and then they are forced to kill you. Worst case scenario, you burnt one of their actions to kill you, and now they are moving one action slower. Best case scenario, they burnt both of their actions to kill you, and now they can't do anything at all. Option number 2 is to use your Harrying Raven model to tie things up. Remember, Corvus Cabal are fast, they are movement 5. You could use Harrying Raven on your familiar Cabalist or your much more valuable Shadow Piercer, and then run 10 inches and then tie them up the same turn you used it. The only downside of this play is that you're not utilizing the full 20 inches, but it's a guaranteed way to lock something down for at least one action, and much more likely 2 actions if it's your Shadow Piercer. The final way to use this is to use Harrying Raven on something and then just wait it out, do the rest of your turn, and the second that model does make a move, you use Raptor Strike to tie them up. That is the most complex way of using it and requires the most setup, but it's also the most space-brained, and it can catch your opponent out if they aren't paying attention to your Raptor Strikes and your Harrying Raven. You can absolutely catch someone who is moving without really thinking, so bear that in mind. Oh, now on to the good stuff. This is our first triple, and it is Swooping Attack, and it can only be used by the Shri Talon, but boy howdy, oh, Swooping Attack. Okay, this thing's something special. This fighter makes a bonus move action. In addition, if this fighter finishes that move action 2 inches vertically lower than their starting position, they can make a bonus attack. So this is Rampage with a few more steps, but it's also much, much better than Rampage for a number of reasons. Firstly, Shri Talons are movement 8, so they get to move a full 8 inches and then get to attack at least twice for free, or 3 times if they're doing the little jumping down thing. And of course, when combined with Plunging Killaz, you're also going to strength 6 when you do this, so it's move 8 inches, go to strength 6, and then throw out 10 attacks, or 15 attacks if you started elevated. This sounds really powerful, and that's because it really, really is. Swooping Attack is unbelievably powerful now. With the strength 6 Shri Talon Plunging Killaz stuff, This thing's immense, especially when Shrike Talons are now 40 points cheaper than they were earlier in the year. There are two main ways to use swooping attack, and the first is to start elevated and then jump off and do shenanigans. For this, it does require some setup the turn before, or a good deployment where you could start elevated at the start of a turn. From this elevated position, you have a 9-inch threat range. That's an 8-inch move with a 1-inch attack range. Anything in that 9-inch bubble is at risk of being attacked 15 times at strength 6. That is a lot of attacks at a very, very high strength. The second and most common way you will use swooping attack is from the ground. How this works is you will use one of your actions to move up to 6 inches and then climb a surface 2 inches. Because of how climbing rules work, you are allowed to cling on a surface until the end of your activation. From this clinging position, you then use swooping attack. This gives you a bonus move action, so another 8 inches of movement. You then launch your Shrike Talon towards the enemy and then get your bonus attack action and your last action as an attack action. With the initial 6-inch movement plus the 8 inches of bonus movement plus the 1 inch of attack range, this gives the Shrike Talon a whopping 15-inch threat range and is still able to pump out 10 attacks at strength 6. Swooping attack is a menace. You can cover half the board from the ground and still gain the benefits of swooping attack and Plunging Killaz effortlessly. Nothing on the board is safe, providing they are on the ground floor. If enemies start climbing up on top of things, it gets a bit tricky to pull off, but for the most part, you have free reign of the board to murder whatever you want. Swooping attack, in conjunction with the cheaper Shrike Talons and Plunging Killaz, is now, in my opinion, one of the best abilities in the game, and people really are not prepared to deal with it. I've run a lot of Plunging Killaz Corvus Cabal, and their swooping attack is a game changer in this new format. People simply aren't prepared for the amount of reliable damage you can pump out from an incredible distance. And as a final aside, against ranged units, 90% of Warcry's ranged units, their premier ranged threats, have a shorter range than your Shrike Talon. If they want to shoot your most valuable piece to kill your Shrike Talon from a distance, they have to walk into murder range. And frankly, that's a fun time. Say goodbye to Quiet Pox, say goodbye to Slan. That's not an exaggeration, I have killed many Slan. But that isn't the full story. I will go over the Shrike Talon and the final trick they can pull off once we go over Shrike Talons in a little bit. For now, we're going to move on to the next triple, which is kind of bad. It is Grizzly Trophy. I'm going to just put it on screen, badoosh, or badoosh, and then just not really talk about much more of it. You can read it, it's pretty pants. It can only be used by your leader, and it grants a bubble of +1 attack within 9 inches, but you've got to get a kill, and it's unreliable, it's gambly. I would much rather use that triple to pump in a swooping attack, or use the double for Raven Dart. Like, Grizzly Trophy is just unbelievably underwhelming. Yeah, you might pull it off sometimes, but I am fairly confident in saying you would use almost anything else. It is the big loser here. And finally, we have our quad Death from Above. I'm going to keep this short and sweet because Death from Above is just swooping attack, but usable by everybody. You get a bonus move action, you get a bonus attack action, and if you do your little jumping down thingy, well, you even get +1 strength. Throw in Plunging Killaz, you get +3 strength overall, and this is on everybody, so your basic chaff go to strength 6, and everyone else goes to strength 7. How I use Death from Above is I basically get to treat any model in my warband as a Shrike Talon, which is pretty cool. Granted, they're only movement 5 and not movement 8, which does pull back their threat range quite substantially, but it allows things like Spire Stalkers to be a backup Shrike Talon. It allows things like your Shadow Piercer to be a backup Shrike Talon. It's a really strong quad that, if you roll naturally, is always nice to have. Would I ever invest in the quad if I had a triple? I don't think so. In most cases, I would much rather just have swooping attack and have the Shrike Talon do that on the cheap. Exceptions would be if there's something with toughness 6 on the board. I would really want to get that strength 7. In that case, I would still use it on the Shrike Talon, if I'm being perfectly honest, but just to get him to strength 7 as opposed to using swooping attack. But for the most part, a natural quad is nice to see. but you will likely just keep swooping attack for most things. So on to units, we have the Shadow Piercer. He is our leader. He has movement 5, toughness 4 and 20 wounds, 4 attacks, strength 4 and 2/5 damage for 170 points. He's okay. That's all I can really say. He's reasonably priced. He's reasonably durable. He's okay in combat. That 2/5 is quite nice. The 5 crits, very respectable. He has access to Harrying Raven, right? Raven Dart. But overall, he's fine. I like the Shadow Piercer. I use him more as a bit of a brawler, a bit of a treasure carrier because he's got quite a few wounds, right? He's absolutely solid. So next up, we have the Shri Talon. And whew, this guy's good. Movement 8, toughness 4, 20 wounds, 5 attacks, strength 4, 2/4 damage for 170 points. He's the same price as the Shadow Piercer, and he is simply better in every way. He has +1 attack. He has -1 crit, to be fair, but he's also got +3 movement. He is just as tough, just as durable, just as strong. He has access to swooping attack. Where the Shri Talon really starts to sing is if you are using blessings. You can give the Shri Talon a +1 damage blessing for 25 points, bringing him to 195 points. This will give him a 5-4-3-4 profile, which is incredibly reliable. Bearing in mind, we are using Plunging Killaz all of the time, almost guaranteed to use Plunging Killaz every single turn. So we are actually 5 attacks, strength 6, 3/4 damage. But what does this mean in terms of the maths? Well, it means for every attack action you can pull off with this guy, you are doing around about 10 to 12 damage. So if you can get your 10 attacks off with your swooping attack, which is the most common way of doing that, you are doing around about 20 to 24 damage. In case you missed it, most things do actually die to that. If you manage to pull off your Big Mama Jamba 15 attack turn, you are looking at somewhere in the region of 30 to 33 damage, which is enough to start killing ogres. It's enough to start potentially one-shotting Fomroid Crushers. It's enough to kill just about anything in the entire game from a disgusting range. And of course, all of these high wound models tend to have a much higher price than your Shri Talon, which is always good to see. Common things you will see on battlefields today are things like Vexmore, Gutlords, and Brute Bosses, and guess what kills all 3 of those on average every single time? That's right, the Shri Talon can absolutely murderize some of the best models in the entire game in a single activation, and there's nothing they can do about it. It's insane. I have killed so many high profile things because the Shri Talon is a blender. He's an assassin of unreal magnitudes. But I just said this before, he's also a blender. He's a horde clearing monster. 10 to 12 damage per 5 attacks is the perfect number to start killing chaff. Everything from skinks to skeletons to humans to dwarfs to plague bearers all die on average to the Shri Talon with a single attack action. This allows the Shri Talon to swooping attack in and kill up to 3 models, and because the base of the Shri Talon is deceptively large, it's quite easy to do so. Even if your Shri Talon was to immediately die after doing this, you've just done a 3-for-1 trade and likely gained all of your points back because the average point cost of a chaff unit is around about 65 points. And your guy is only 195. As you can probably tell, I'm a huge fan of Shri Talons, and with a little bit of finesse and a little bit of know-how, you can get these guys to sing. They are one of the best units in Warcry. They are by far the best assassin in Warcry. You can just pick a point and just murder things wherever you go. They are incredible. They are so good and so cheap now. You can easily take 2 into any list. With 2 Shri Talons, you are really looking to get 2 swooping attacks off every turn. And again, if you do get 2 swooping attacks off with Plunging Killaz with your Shri Talons, you're looking at 2 major pieces dying or up to 6 models getting mulched if they aren't prepared for the murder that's about to happen. These guys are pivotal to the Corvus Cabal success. If these guys die, pray you've done enough to win the game, because these guys are so pivotal, so important to Corvus Cabal that once they're gone, you will lose almost all of your ability to impact the game. They are that good that they turn Corvus Cabal from bottom tier to, I'm not even joking, like mid, possibly even a top tier list, simply because Shrike Talons are such a dangerous threat now. It's so cool to see. But let's stop gushing and move on to Spire Stalkers. These guys are kind of like mid-range, right? These guys are movement 5, toughness 4, 15 wounds with a 4-4-2-4 attack profile for only 130 points. Spire Stalkers are in a weird place because Shrike Talons are so good. Spire Stalkers do tend to get overlooked, and of course because we have fairly cheap chaff, Spire Stalkers tend to get overlooked. They're in a very weird place where you don't really need them, right? For objective play, their Swift Climb's great, but again, you have Shrike Talons. If you want to do objective or treasure play, Shrike Talons being movement 8 with bonus move actions for days, they're actually better at it. So, Spire Stalkers are, even though they're as good in combat as your Shadow Piercer, who's 40 points more expensive and has 15 wounds, which is very respectable. 15 wounds, toughness 4 is very respectable. I just don't find them good enough. I've taken them a few times, and the extra bulk and the extra like brawly melee profile is very nice. But they start to eat into that model count, especially if you're running 2 Shrike Talons. You just don't really have the points to maintain the numbers to take Spire Stalkers, which is a real shame because they are good. They're really good, but they're just not quite good enough compared to everything else. Our final units are the Cabalists, and we have these guys in 3 variants. I'll put all 3 on screen now. Long story short, they're all good. If you're running all in-faction Corvus Cabal, which is how I would always run them now, with Plunging Killaz, all in faction battle traded up Corvus Cabal are, in my opinion, the best way to run them now. You will use a combination of all 3 of these. And the reason for that is because of weird pointing, right? You'll quickly find out that you have an awkward number of points left over after you've finished your list. You'll have too many points to invest into blessings, but also not enough points to upgrade a Cabalist into a Spire Stalker. So what tends to happen is you'll start throwing a few points here and there into upgrading your basic Cabalists, who are really, really good at 65 points, into Cabalists with Familiars for more Harry and Raven, or into Spears because that range and +1 crit's actually really, really good. A 4-3-1-4 profile at 2 inches is a solid profile, and if you can pull off Plunging Killaz, great, right? That's a 4-5-1-4. It's good to see. So even though the Cabalist with Spear is a little bit too expensive, and the Cabalist with Familiar is just more expensive, but gets an ability, right, you'll actually end up using all 3, which is very unusual because conventional wisdom would say that just take a bunch of the 65-point Cabalists, but that's just not how it's going to work in most lists, and that's just the way it is. So that's Corvus Cabal, and boy howdy, whew. These guys are something special. These guys are glass cannons. They're very squishy. If you don't take Spire Stalkers in particular, your lists become very squishy and you have very clear targets your opponent will want to kill. And that is basically kill your Strike Talons, kill your Shadow Piercer, you lose all damage and all durability, and then you just crumble, right? That's really bad. You are very much glass cannons, and your cannon is almost entirely centered on those Shrike Talons. You want to use them wisely, you want to get good trades, and you really want to play those odds in your favor. A common scenario will be you have a big thing you can kill, or you have some chaff you could kill. And that's a difficult choice to make. Sure, on average, your 15 attacks might kill that big guy, but if you don't, you're likely going to die because Shrike Talons are quite squishy. So maybe the correct solution is to instead dive bomb into some chaff and kill their backline. Start killing off all their squishy stuff and then pull that big thing away from your guys and cause distractions. There's all kinds of ways of playing your Shrike Talons, and as murderous as they are, you really don't want to be throwing them all willy-nilly. You want to think about what you want to kill, how to keep them safe, so you can murder turn after turn after turn. A savvy opponent will absolutely figure out that the Shrike Talon's biggest weakness is being locked in combat. If you can't get your +2 strength from jumping off things, your combat potential plummets, because being strength 4 simply isn't good enough to get those reliable kills, even with 10 attacks at 3-4 damage, and having to disengage and then do all your climbing and jumping, your attack numbers also plummet, even if you try to get Plunging Killaz to proc that same turn as you disengaged. So definitely bear that in mind. Newer players or players who aren't quite prepared for the shitstorm that are Shri Talons might just try and stay away, try and run away from them. But a more experienced player who can handle this kind of pressure will absolutely start pinning these guys down with chaff, and once they do, your guys are in a lot of trouble. So definitely keep that big old weakness in mind, because that's just as fatal as your Shri Talons being killed. So that's the video, but before I go, I'm going to throw up a little list that I like to use. Badoosh or Badoosh. This is my go-to competitive list right now, and it is very, very powerful if you manage to keep your Shri Talons safe and sound. But that's the end of the video. If you liked what you saw and what you heard, please consider leaving a like, a comment and subscribing, as that helps the channel out immensely. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of new Corvus Cabal. Do you agree that these guys are now above D tier? Do you agree that they're above mid tier? Do you think Shri Talons are as dangerous as I've made them out to be? Let me know down below and we'll have a good old natter about it. Until next time, lads, ladies and everybody in between and beyond, ta-ra. Boy howdy, it's me, it's Toast, and we are here once again with the post-Toast credits. As always, a huge shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers, Armor Enthusiast 7, CT6497, Girth Demon, The Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Long Run Hobbies, Lord Filax, Sable Saber, Brioche, Steve Bean, The Houston Toad, Tough Tootin' Baby, and Velas. A huge thank you for all of your support, and I will see you all next time.
Spice. He knows about